All right, good morning. How's everyone doing? Good, all right. I like that I actually got a response and not just blank stares. Just so everyone knows, I'll introduce myself in a minute, but my other life is also as a group fitness instructor, so I do sometimes require some participation. Make sure that people don't just sit there staring blankly. So we'll have some fun, no worries. So this is Soft Skills, Hard Truths, the other side of project management. That being said, I think the majority of us, or maybe all of us in this room, can agree that having those soft skills is not just for project and program managers. Really, it's anybody. How do you have the right conversations? How do you have difficult conversations? And really, what's the best way to do that? And how can you actually take what you know and get better at it? So my name is Danielle Sheffler. I'm a senior program manager at Acquia. I sometimes use Twitter, so that's my Twitter handle if you want to tweet at me now throughout the presentation, or if you want to wait till after and connect. More than happy to do that. Somebody pointed out that the slides have confidential and proprietary. My slide deck just did not update when I took that out. We're talking about soft skills. This is not anything that is actually proprietary, so when this goes up, don't worry about it. Share it, do whatever you want to do, so don't worry about that. So the most important part is, what are we covering? So we want to identify skills, not just with clients, right? Because sometimes our clients are ourselves, or maybe it's an internal team, but we also mostly work with a team of people, even internally. So how do we actually get their trust, and how do we develop those skills, and what are they? So these are the 5 skills that we're mostly talking about today. There are others, such as making people feel safe, having a good culture. So it isn't something where we'll be able to cover everything in 45 minutes of talking and Q&A, but this is a good base. And then just understanding how you can actually start applying these, so we're not just talking about what the skills are and really what each component of each one is. So what this presentation is not. You are not going to come out of here and magically become a consultant in one day. And let's say you do mostly implementation work. You're not going to know how to have, the perfect conversation. First of all, because perfect doesn't exist. It's also kind of boring, if we're honest. But at the same time, we do want to take kind of from that beginning level, or even if you've done this for a while, and intermediate, and just figure out what we can do to grow all of our skills. So with that being said, sorry, we already went through that. Let me come back. All right, there we go. So where do we begin, and really why are we even having this conversation? So a lot of us, whether it's personally, within our company, whether it's our division of our company, whatever it is, we have a methodology. It could be waterfall, it could be agile, it could be agifall, or however you like to combine those two terms. It could be some other combination. That being said, just following that process does not guarantee a successful project, right? We all know that a project should have discovery, requirements gathering. We obviously need to do some development work at some point, depending on the contract, right? We need to do UAT. That doesn't mean, though, that just doing that equals a great project at the end, right? We have to talk to our clients, we have to talk to our internal team, we have to talk and communicate with a lot of different people. So knowing how to have those conversations, you'll hear me say this about 1,000 times in this presentation, is really what helps us set ourselves up for success. And again, as I've noted, these skills can be used by anyone on the project. So that being said, this first participation question is not going to be hard. I'm just curious who's in the room. So who is a project program manager, some sort of title around that? All right, how many developers do I have in the room? What about UX, design, marketing? Awesome. Is there anybody that doesn't fit in one of those categories? Okay. I just like to know who's here. So we can tell that we have a wide variety of individuals in this room, right? Sometimes some of you might be playing multiple roles, but know that everything that we talk about, you can walk out of the room and at least do something with, okay? So now that we've talked about all of that, let's go through the first one. Might seem like the most obvious one because it's listening. But what we need to make sure that we think about is that active listening is not enough. It isn't something where we can sit and listen to our clients, to our teammates, whoever you're talking to, You'll kind of nod your head, ask some questions, take some notes, and have that be enough. So we need to use empathy. We need to know how to, have the difference, right, between talking one-on-one. So if I'm talking to you, that might be a different conversation, right, than if I'm talking to this whole group here in a separate conversation. So now we want to talk about barriers to listening. So here's where we get our fun audience participation, because this slide is blank for a reason. So can anyone think of any barriers to listening? Like what makes listening difficult when we're in, a room, a call, anything?
Multitasking.
Okay, multitasking. Anybody else?
Mobile phone.
Okay, phone. Anyone else?
Sometimes it's like people talk at very different speeds and think at very different speeds. It's really hard to listen to them if they're too slow or too fast.
Okay, so talking in and at different speeds, maybe different tones, things of that nature. Yeah.
Cultural barriers.
Okay, cultural barriers, right?
Frequency.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Like frequency bias or notions.
Okay, that's great.
Working with difficult people.
Okay, working with difficult people, that's a good one. Back here.
Jargon and terminology.
Jargon and terminology. All right, and I'm sorry, there's someone back there.
Communication style.
Communication style. These are great. All right, so all of those are excellent. So they all build onto exactly what we have here. So the first one is talking. So I don't know if we touch on that one exactly, but it kind of goes back to the last slide I had, where sometimes somebody's talking and you have a thought, right? And it's almost like when you were young and you were in school and you just wanted to raise your hand right away and the teacher's still talking for another 2 minutes, but you have to say what you want to say. And just thinking about that takes you away from the conversation. So that's one. The other one, we definitely touched on distractions, right? We have our computers, we have, pen and paper. I at least still use that when I'm in meetings. I don't know about everybody else. We have phones, Slack messages, things like that. We really have a lot of, items that are taking us away from what we're trying to do. And again, so I know somebody said multitasking, exactly. It's really trying to do too many things at once. The other one sort of goes with listening, but really plays into many of these, is not getting personal. And I know that sounds odd, because if you're talking to your teammates or your client, you don't necessarily want to be like, I had a bad breakup, and then I fell this morning, and then, I was just running late. Like, you don't need to go right into your whole life story, but we're talking about trust, right, and how to build trust. So with that being said, it's as simple on a Monday morning call. So how was your weekend? It was great. I really enjoyed the weather because it wasn't, 100 degrees outside. Oh yeah, what did you do? And obviously it's not trying to take up 10 whole minutes of the call, right, as to, what happened over the weekend, but at the same time, you're learning a little bit more about the people that you're working with, and they'll start to let their guard down a little bit, and it won't just be about, we're trying to get through requirements gathering, and we're working on JIRA tickets, and we're doing this. It just isn't as firm. It allows you to open up a little bit. So with that being said, using empathy. So we are using the dictionary definition here. It's the ability to understand and share in another person's feelings. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have been in that person's shoes before, right? So I know some of us in this room might be lucky to have been both on the vendor side and the client side, so we can relate a little bit. But there are a lot of people who haven't been in that situation. Or for example, if you are a project or a program manager, you may have never been a developer and vice versa. So there are some things that block that, ability to understand sometimes. But at the same time, we can still really think about the other side. So while we would love to pretend like there are never any problems in our project, right? Sometimes the client is disappointed in the work. So you can either make it an us versus them or you versus them situation, or you can find a good way to phrase the conversation. So I'm really sorry, it sounds like we haven't met your expectations. Could you please tell us what we can do to make it better? Now, we say that, does that mean that the client is always right? No. If they are asking for 3 weeks of extra work, right, that does not fit in our time scope and budget, the client might not be right, and we start to talk to them, right, about reprioritizing, etc. But we don't need to have that conversation and shut them down and say, no, we can't do that. You can have the conversation of, we really want to hear what you have to say. We want to understand, where you think maybe things went wrong, where we went off the rails. How do you think we can work together? We'd really like to make sure that we can make this work. And then, later, right, you have the conversations about change requests and all these things that we do in our projects. But it makes that conversation a little bit easier than just if we say no right away and don't really think about how they're feeling. Because let's be honest, if we were on the other side, if we could ask for 3 weeks of free work and get it, like, wouldn't you try it too? So just thinking about it from that perspective. The things to avoid though, it's one small word, but trying to avoid the word but. Even though it might seem odd, it does have a negative connotation. So I hear what you're saying, but that's out of scope. It might be out of scope, but I hear what you're saying. I want to understand your requirements. Let's see if we can fit this into the project or if we need to do some reprioritization or get creative to how we can solve the problem. That is so small, but just the way that it comes across is a lot more open. And then the other piece is saying, I understand. Sometimes that's not so bad. But again, if your client is disappointed or they're really frustrated and you're thinking or saying, I understand, their reaction is probably going to be a little bit defensive. Like, do you really understand? Because if you understood, we wouldn't be in this situation anyway. Like, it starts to create a defense. It's okay if you don't understand. Just try to use one of the other tactics to move forward. So the other part is listening in groups. So this gets a little interesting. I'm not sure how many people have this situation, but at least with Acquia, we actually do a lot of remote work. So sometimes it's easier and sometimes it's harder, so we'll talk a little bit about both situations. So with that being said, really think about what people are saying. It's not just about the words, but I apologize, I can't remember who said it, but somebody said something about tone essentially, or speed. Listening to how that comes across. You can generally tell on the phone or Zoom or in person when someone is angry, when they are smiling, when they're talking to you. You can hear when they're laughing. Honestly, sometimes some people are very difficult to read, and that's when you have to ask those follow-up questions, but just listen to that. The other piece goes back to not just doing active listening. Something that I always try to do is stop. First of all, ask, does this make sense before we move on, making sure that the client, team, whoever I'm talking to is comfortable, but also making sure that you're stating back what you've heard. So what I heard is you are asking for, XYZ functionality that, does this and you need it in 2 weeks. It also sounds like it's something that you're very, very passionate about. So when we're looking at our MVP, it sounds like you want that to be first. Is that correct? Maybe it's not correct, but at least that way they feel heard and that they know that you're listening to what they're saying. The other thing is group dynamics. So I really appreciate somebody bringing up, bias. Sometimes it's not always bias, right? But sometimes the way that things are stated by gender, by culture, maybe if you're talking to a manager, if you're talking to a direct report, just the way that you're directing that language, what you're saying is also very, very important. And just thinking about those words and those emotions that are coming out of your mouth and that you're portraying, just really thinking through that as well. The other part, and again, this is where it comes down to where I was saying if you work remotely, right, this is a little bit more difficult and why it's great if you can be on camera, but trying to scan the group for body language, right? Because sometimes somebody might say yes, or okay, that sounds good. But you don't really know what the tone of their voice is, and so it's not until they're crossing their arms or rolling their eyes, hopefully they're smiling, whatever it might be. You can't really tell unless if you have their body language in front of you, that you're able to actually look at through camera, in person, and then you can start directing things to try to pull a little bit more information out of them. And then the last piece is acknowledge when someone is not being included in the conversation, right? Sometimes Some people are just afraid to speak their, opinion because they're worried it's going to be wrong. Sometimes, let's be honest, we have that one person in the room that likes to control the whole conversation and be the one to make all the decisions and to talk and pretty much do what I'm doing now, except not giving a presentation and doing it. So with that being said, making sure that you're pulling out as much information as possible from that person. So with that being said, we've talked about listening. How do we actually put that into practice? So hopefully it goes without saying that you want to pay attention, right? You want to try to get rid of those distractions as much as possible. And you need to care about what other people are saying. Even if you're tired, you're frustrated, just kind of putting on that mask sometimes, I hate to say it, but fake it till you make it if you need to, and really make sure that you're all in. If you need to have a distraction, or let's say, for instance, if you're doing discovery requirements gathering, and since we are not robots, we can't remember everything, right, that we've heard, we might need to have our, computers open. We might need to have pen and paper next to us. Just acknowledge that and tell whoever that you're talking to that you're going to do it, and say, you know what, I am very interested in what you're saying. I want to make sure that I capture everything and that I don't lose what we're talking about. So if you see me looking at my computer, if you see me taking notes, I am hearing what you're saying. I just want to make sure that I have it down. So just make sure to acknowledge that. And again, state what you've heard. So we talked about that a few times. Also making sure, if you can, to use people's names. It feels a lot more personal. I've done that when I'm in a conversation one-on-one. Sometimes people think it's a little weird, honestly, because people are used to hearing their name in a one-on-one conversation. But at the same time, it does feel a little bit more direct, and like you're talking specifically to that person, that you're hearing what they're saying, and it just makes them feel a little bit better sometimes. Again, using body language and changing your voice tone. Making sure that you're keeping it about the other people on the team. Sometimes obviously if you need to say, okay, I'll take this action item, right? That needs to be about you. But in general, it isn't about being right. It isn't, challenging the other person. It's all working as one team and making sure that the other people are being heard. And the other thing is, don't be afraid to think out loud. There are times when, a client comes out, say, with a requirement. I have somewhat of a technical background. I've been using Drupal for a long time, but we have developers and technical architects for that reason. I'm not the one architecting the system. But sometimes I'll say, okay, you know what, whoever my, technical architect is, he might completely disagree with me, but I think this is what I'm hearing your requirement. I think this is how we can do it, but, so-and-so, could you please verify? It might seem odd because, I'm not perfect, right? I'm not giving them the perfect solution, but at the same time, it's showing, there are places where I need to grow too. I care about you. I'm trying my best. I really want to show that I'm invested in what you're doing, and we all work together and see we're actually having a conversation about your solution. It isn't just something where we take it back and, we don't have these conversations in front of you. We're bringing you into them. So all of these things can happen when you're with, clients, teams, etc. It might feel a little bit awkward, but if you have a mentor, if you have a manager, if you have teammates who are willing to work through these with you, it's always a really good thing to come up with practice sessions. You might only need to do one for 10 minutes every 2 weeks. Like I said, it does sometimes feel very, very awkward to do it where you're coming up with fake situations, but it does help you get a little bit more prepared as you actually get in front of, a situation that maybe you're not expecting. So with that being said, skill number 2, collaborate and don't compete. So we already talked about that before, but it isn't about who's right. It isn't us versus them, you versus them. It isn't, I have the right answer all the time. It's something where we all want to work together. So in terms of what are our barriers, thinking about ourselves too much. So how does this affect me? Whether it's my job, I'm looking for a promotion. Is it, I want to shine, I'm afraid I'm going to make a mistake. Just not always thinking about yourself. And same thing about not wanting to win. The next piece, 3, kind of seems like 1. It isn't about you. that actually isn't necessarily thinking about yourself. What that means is, right, when sometimes people get scared, when, they're worried about their job, right? Sometimes we've had clients that have said, my job depends on this, and something doesn't go perfectly and they start to get scared, or, people lash out, start acting a little, let's be honest, kind of crazy, getting a little emotional, and they react that way towards you, and you're sitting there like, okay, I know things aren't perfect, but I'm not exactly sure what happened. Just remembering it's about the project, it's not personal, like 99.9% of the time. So just, we'll talk about ways that we can sort of shift our mind when things like that happen, but just know that if somebody reacts a certain way, it isn't necessarily personal. The other piece is lack of confidence, right? Sometimes we get into scary situations. We might be presenting to the VP of our company, and that can be really scary if you've never done it before. And, how do you react to that? Are you talking too much? Are you using too many words? Are you umming? Whatever it might be. Just knowing exactly how to find that confidence. And again, even if you have to fake it to make it, just how do you make that happen? Because you're all working towards one goal. Criticizing too much. So this happens sometimes both internally, right, and with other people. Because really, who wants a project to go south or for something to go wrong? No one, right? We always want things to go well. We know that it won't, but we always hope we have that like magical situation, right, where it will always go well. We know that isn't the case, but it's making sure essentially that you're picking your battles. Because of the fact too, people aren't gonna wanna work with you, right, if you're always criticizing yourself too much or criticizing them. But it's also about putting yourselves in the other person's shoes. So for example, we've had times where it's like, oh my gosh, how does the client not understand MVP? Like I've already talked about this 3 times. Well, MVP is our life, right? We know MVP, but if somebody's never done Agile before, they don't understand the process. So it might take 4 or 5 different ways to explain it. I had a client who did like cabling and wiring. If you asked me how to do their work, I don't know. Does that make me dumb? You know what I mean? Or not get it? No, it's just not my, domain of expertise. So we need to think, in terms of that as well. Other piece, a lot of times we are leaders, especially if we're in the project or program management realm. We want to lead all the time because that feels natural to us. It's okay if you are the follower, right? Again, we're not robots. We don't know everything. So be willing to step back a little bit. Other piece, wanting immediate gratification, like, great job, that was fantastic. We're so happy that, we're working on our team. Or not tolerating ambiguity. Again, clients, teammates, whatever we're talking about, maybe they've never done this before. They might need to go back and get an answer. Happens with us too, right? We sometimes have to say, I would love to answer that for you. I actually need to go back and verify a few things. I'll make sure that by tomorrow close of business, I'll get that to you. That might be scary to the client too, but it's just the way that it is. So sometimes we have to just take a pause, stop, and realize that it's okay if we're not, going full steam ahead. And the other thing is not wanting to manage conflicts, because again, no one likes when things go a little bit south. But conflict is conflict. It's not always a bad thing. Sometimes it makes us trust other people more. It makes us have a more open, direct, transparent relationship. So it's not always a bad thing. So that being said, how do you put this into practice? So again, these might feel a little awkward. And also when you are very busy, it's probably not going to be at the top of your list, but it will help make your project a little bit better. So if you are having project issues, just think about some of the issues, write it down. Just think about how you can contribute. Could you have done anything better? Do you want to talk to some teammates about what you all can do? Just really think through that. Or if it's an issue with a teammate, can you talk to a manager? Can you talk to them directly and work through it? So coping with fear-based reactions. So that's mostly if you have a situation and you realize that you're really scared of how to deal with it. So for example, the VP example that I gave you before, where you're presenting to the VP of the company and they ask you a question and you get really scared and you're not really confident about it. If you had that situation again, or if you get into that situation, right, being a little bit more proactive than reactive, how can you handle that? Next piece is the all about me that we said before, where it's what happens if somebody's screaming at me. Hopefully you haven't had that happen before, but sometimes it does. People get really angry. How do you handle that? How do you learn to either, escalate the problem to a superior, or how do you learn how to de-escalate that yourself? Do you feel empowered to do some of that de-escalation? And what does that look like? It might be as simple as, I realize that you're angry. I can absolutely hear that. This conversation, unfortunately, isn't very productive. So I think it would be great to table it until later. Let's schedule a time when we've just all stepped back. Sometimes it seemed very simple, but it does help. And then the other piece, right? We've talked about all these things we can do to improve. We all bring great things to the table. I hate to say, what makes you unique, right? But sometimes you have very unique skills, right? Or you just have strengths. Some people are very afraid of delivering bad news, right? Or being transparent with a client because, that can sometimes go either in a good way or a bad way. That might be your strength of knowing how to deliver that well. So thinking about that as well. And then some of the others, be willing to say thank you if you get compliments, and be willing to give compliments. If somebody says, you did a really great job, with that report. Oh, well, it's just my job, so it's fine. Just say thank you. It's okay. It's okay to accept a compliment every now and then. So again, needing instant results, taking that pause, even if it's only for 5 seconds, thinking about, do I really need these results right now? Sometimes we do, right? Sometimes our entire development effort could be blocked if we don't have, right, a certain item. And so we need to deliver that news. But sometimes it's just because we're trying to go full steam ahead in parallel with something else, and it's not really as important to get, that instant, result or gratification. Acknowledge when you're not seeing eye to eye. It's so much better to do that right away than to wait, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, etc. Risks and escalations can happen at the drop of a hat. If we've been doing projects, even for a year or two, I think we've all learned that lesson, that if something goes wrong, either internally or with a client, that things can escalate really quickly. So the sooner that you acknowledge it and have that conversation, the better. And the last part is talking about the project. Try to say we instead of I. That can go both internally and when you're talking with clients, because really, right, you still want to see yourselves all as one team, and it's not this person's the program manager, this person's the product owner. Of course, they all have their own roles and responsibilities, but knowing that you're all working together to get to an end result is really how we want to make everybody feel. All right, so we've talked about listening and partnering. The next part is improvising. So if anybody has somehow managed to plan out every single detail of a conversation personally or professionally, kudos to you, because it is impossible. So with that being said, we do still need to know, right, how to deal with things when, again, things are going well or maybe things aren't going so well. How do we handle that? So we need to learn how to listen and to be more collaborative. So I'm sure you've all realized, right, all of these go hand in hand. It's not all segmented and siloed. So with this one, right, there's basically just putting it into practice, and it's really making sure to not overthink. That doesn't mean that you have to say the first thing that comes to your head, right? You do want to at least, I always joke, I call it the brain to mouth filter, like making sure that you do at least think a little bit about what you want to say, or if you're not sure and you need some time, I've done I think this is what you're saying, just give me about 30 seconds or a minute to think through, because I want to make sure that I'm giving you the right information. Okay, here's what, and then you start delivering the message. It's okay to not say it right away, but you also want to make sure that you're not sitting there for 5 minutes and, really just messing with your own head, I should say. The other part is yes and. So making sure, instead of yes but, it becomes yes and adding on to that. The third one seems really weird, right? Focus on being real. A lot of times we think about having our two separate personalities, right? We have our personal personality and then we have our work personality. I am not trying to say that you have to be exactly at work the way that you are when you are in person, right? There's a reason why we have a separation there. But at the same time, again, when we talk about, how to deliver that news, how to make people feel more comfortable, how to just get a little bit more personal with people, how do you do that? Just focus on showing them that you are a real person and that you're not just there as their designer, as their developer, as their project manager, as the person who just happens to be put on the same team with them. The other thing, again, we keep saying, don't feel like you have to be right. We are going to say that like 20 more times, but it is really, really important to just check your ego at the door so that you can work well with other people. And then again, it does seem a little awkward, but practice with a teammate as to what, might happen. You might be surprised and you think the client's going to be really, really upset. Like I usually honestly go with the worst case scenario, and then you deliver the news or it happens with a teammate and you're like, wow, that took like 30 seconds of a conversation. That went really, really well. But what happens if it doesn't go well and they're upset or they start using inflammatory language or somebody, gets really frustrated or feels vulnerable or, right, any range of human emotions that can happen during conversations when we're passionate about our work? Isn't it better to be prepared and know how you might handle a situation, based off of what might be said to you, and then you have it in your pocket for later? I can tell you I've been doing this type of work for almost 15 years, and I actually started out in the consulting world, and I'm still sometimes learning from these conversations, right? Because again, every person is different. Every person comes with different experiences, so we just are mindful of that. So we've talked about listening, we've talked about partnering, we've talked about improvising. Now we're talking about knowing yourself, which might seem silly because, you could be 95, right, and still not know yourself 100%. But at the same time, as we start going through our work life, as we get a little bit older, or not even sometimes age, right? Sometimes it's based off of our experiences that we've had. There are a lot of different things that play into it, culture, all of these different things, right? We start to know ourselves a little bit better as we get through different situations. That being said, it can be really scary and sometimes difficult to evaluate ourselves because while we might not want to be perfect, we usually don't want to admit that we're bad at something, right? Like nobody goes, oh yeah, I'm absolutely awful at that. Or you know what, that's a skill that I just really don't have because I feel like I should have it for my job, or whatever the reason is why you feel like you should have a certain skill set or strength. It's not always easy. But that being said, it really helps work better with people if you know what your strengths are so you can play up to them. And then maybe what, I hate using the word weaknesses, but you know what, everybody has them. We again are not robots, we're all human. So what are those things that we need to get a little bit better at? So the first thing is writing down the values that are important to you. So that could be personal, it could be professional, whatever it is. What do you care about the most? Is it making sure that the client's at ease for you? Is it something where you want to make sure that if you're selling the client something, you're selling them the right thing and you're, focusing on being real? What are the things that you care about and the goals that you have as you go through work? Might not be for that particular project, whatever it is, right? It's just something that's important to you. The next thing is doing a self-assessment at least once a year. So, right, usually we think about self-assessments when it comes to review time, when it comes to promotions. Why are we caring about what we do just to get promoted, right? We work better with people when we know what our strengths are and what we need to work on. It lets people trust you more because you're acknowledging that you have things to work on. It just makes your relationships better. So whether it's working with a manager, if there's a template, if it's something where you want to just do it on your own and work through that way, totally up to you and potentially to your organization, right? But at the same time, just really thinking through that. And along with that is trying to work with your manager to collect 360-degree feedback. I would say this is probably, of everything on the list, the most uncomfortable, right? Because it's like, well, I thought that person liked working with me, but even if I don't know who they are and what their feedback, is, right? Because it's anonymous. Oh my gosh, there was this one situation and, things didn't go up. It's scary, but you know what? It'll make you better in the long run. You might feel uncomfortable, but it's all about addressing that and being better at what we do. Next piece is trying something new. Now we want to be careful with this one because if we try a new communication style and we are like 4 months into working with someone, they might be kind of taken aback, right? Where they're like, well, we've never run a meeting like that before, and that doesn't seem like, how Jill, normally works. This is kind of strange. So you might want to ease people into things, or, it's okay to acknowledge and say, you know what, I've really been, learning about this new approach that I think is really interesting. So if you're amenable to it, could we just try it for this meeting? Like, are you open to, me trying this out? If they say no, you try it somewhere else, right? But if they are, then you've kind of given the opportunity. And again, people are seeing that you are trying to learn and grow and get better at your skills and realize that you're being more open. And then the last thing is getting to know people better. So again, that could be, I can give an example for Acquia. We have a lot of different departments, and in professional services, sometimes we work closer than others. There are times when I've maybe been directed to talk to somebody, or somebody, for example, I do accessibility work, somebody's come to talk to me for about 5 minutes, and I've heard their name, and I have no idea what they do, like no idea. So I actually set up like a 30-minute call, if I can, get some time on their calendar and say, can you tell me about your job, a little bit more about what you do day to day, how did this come up, and then eventually you get into the work piece, but you do start to learn a little bit more about them. And then maybe start learning a little bit more about yourself of, well, that sounds really interesting. I've never done that before, or, how can I help this department, or, whatever you might find important, right, to get out of that conversation, but just opening yourself up to something new. So the last piece, everybody's favorite and not favorite at the same time, is transparency, because it's the one, honestly, that can be the most difficult and honestly the scariest. So these sometimes are very difficult because nobody likes to, again, a lot of times deliver bad news. Now, being transparent, right, doesn't always come with bad news, but at least in the project and program management world, that's sometimes how we think of it. So it can be difficult, but the risks strengthen the relationship, and if something goes wrong, the client knows they can trust you. When I've told clients before, you know what, we might not hit the deadline because of X, Y, Z, how do we want to fix this? Of course they're not like, oh good, we might not hit the deadline, that's great. But I have, as the project's gone on, as weird as it sounds, they've actually thanked me for being open about it, because they can course correct with us a lot earlier than, say, if you're 2 weeks beforehand, and it always comes to light, right? Like, it always comes to light when there is something wrong. So why not be the one to bring it to light and try to come up with a solution together and be open about it and figure out how you can fix it, than trying to hide it? Because the instant that you hide it and they find out, you have lost their trust, and trying to get it back is very difficult. So again, address uncomfortable situations. Now, of course, you can, start adding some things in, right? It doesn't have to be like, I wish we had better news, or, I really don't like this part of my job, because we know that it's not the best thing ever to deliver this news. You can say something of, we're evaluating, we're trying to see what happens. Sometimes I try to throw in a little bit of joke, like, wow, everybody got really quiet. Like, tell me how you're thinking, and let's go from there. But at the same time, you have to deliver the news, right? Figure out the best way to do it and what's going to make people feel a little bit more at ease. The last piece, again, deliver it right away. Use short sentences as much as possible, because if you start going on this long rambling thing, you'll be like, okay, what are they hiding? Are they, freaking out, and I now don't have confidence that they know what to do? There's a lot that can go into that, so just try to be as succinct as possible. And again, if you need to practice with someone, practice beforehand. Again, acknowledge your mistakes. It might not be in the exact situation that we were talking about, but we've had times where we've understood a requirement from a client. I've certainly done this, and it's like, okay, it's going to take 3 days. And then we go back and we're like, oh wow, we can actually do that in 2 hours, And so that's great news. But, it shows, right, that we overestimated and we didn't mean to. And, right, we all know that sometimes it happens the opposite, like, oh, okay, it might take now granted, we always build extra time in for our estimates, right? We always build extra time in, but you might say 1 day, and because you found something else, it might be 3 to 4 days. So just acknowledge that, you know what, we didn't hit the mark on that. We're trying to course correct. Again, let's work together to make it happen. And the last thing is be a little bit expressive and be personal. Don't be afraid to have that conversation. I had a client, and I know you can at least see a little bit of my tattoos, but they, couldn't see them. I try to hide them when I'm with clients, but I had a water bottle from an event that I did. And somebody who was like at the VP level starts talking to me about it. He's only involved in the project maybe once every 3 months, but it got that sort of conversation going. He felt like he started to know me a little bit better because we had some things in common. So then when I had to deliver that not so great news, even though we only saw each other a few times, during the project, it was easier because it was, okay, well, we have a little bit of something in common. I remember that conversation, just trying to make sure that we're not being monotone and just hiding everything about ourselves. So I know that's a lot of information, but what I am curious about is if you could take like 30 seconds, and if you had to do like 2 or 3 things after you left this room to put these into practice, just thinking about what you would do, and then I'm interested if people would be willing to share. All right, anyone willing to take the chance, say what they would do? There's clearly no wrong answer, right? Right?
Well, I definitely get stuck on the feeling like it's all about me, and I'm taking things very personally. And that's kind of what I need to work on. Like when people are unhappy about the project, I feel like they're personally attacking everything about my soul, and it just cuts.
Yeah.
And they probably have no idea that that's how it feels to me because I don't even let them see it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of what I need to work on.
And that's a very natural reaction, right? Because this is what we do day in and day out, and so it does feel very personal. Like, what did I do wrong? Is it me? And again, everybody makes mistakes, but that's great to know, right?
I think that also there's power in respect in acknowledging that you have made a mistake, and everyone is human, and if we communicate with each other, we can find a solution together.
Mm-hmm.
That's not bad.
Yeah.
It's actually good.
Yeah.
So sometimes we just have to remind ourselves of that.
Yeah, that's great. Right. Anyone else willing to share?
I hadn't really thought about practicing those scenarios with teammates. That's like a new idea to me. So
Okay, great.
that would be interesting to try for
Okay.
sure.
Yeah, and they might learn something too. You never know.
Often when you're listening to someone going on and on, you get stuck on responding to their first thing. You don't listen to the rest.
Mhm.
So for me, it's jotting down my response to that thing so that I can keep listening to them instead of focusing on what I'm going to say in reply to the first thing they said. And then as I keep going, I might maybe can relax and we can have a conversation
Yeah.
instead of a lectures back and forth.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
And kind of building on what she was just talking about, there's also this sense of awareness when you see someone get fixated on an idea through leading the conversation.
Mhm.
So you kind of let them have that sort of outburst so that you can hopefully not sidetrack the conversation, but bring them back into the conversation so that they're able to listen.
Yeah. So almost like scanning for that body language to tell, like, okay, they have a thought. Let me just, have them get it out, and then we can continue. I think that's great. Anyone else?
I really like that part that you said about being real. I think that's super important. That's kind of what I'm going to take away from it, just to kind of open up some of those barriers.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
Okay, great. All right, so we are almost at time, or right about time, but I wanted to make sure to leave at least a few minutes for questions if anybody has any. Yeah.
I was curious, the transparency issue, how do you handle contingency? Because, obviously, if you share that, it's going to get eaten up. And so how do you handle that?
Yeah, so, again, working in an agile environment and also with scheduling, we try to schedule out more from like a project schedule of, having more time for like UAT at the end and bug fixing and things like that. For us, it's really more in the estimation of the project, but then of course it does come down to the fact, right, of level of effort and putting things into sprints. I feel like it's a lot easier to do if you're in Agile than if you are in a waterfall, or even more in time and materials versus fixed price sometimes. That really gets into it, but it really is just being honest with them. And when I've had people kind of really come back, it's more of the thought too, where I say, okay, so generally people work, 40 hours a week, for example. If somebody asked, or expected a regular 60-hour work week, like what would your response be? It's like, well, I wouldn't work a 60-hour work week. And, I don't go like, exactly. But at the same time, sometimes it opens that up a little bit more. And it is just saying we only have so much time and scope and budget, and making sure that they are seeing those budget numbers every single week, seeing, even again, if you are in fixed price, if you are in, waterfall, whatever it is, like where are you? And being able to, have those metrics. Like sometimes it really is about the metrics to help with a conversation. I don't know if that helps answer your question at all.
Do you intentionally pad the testing? Because, that's usually what ends up hitting. In other words, do you intentionally pad the schedule? Because I'm not talking about necessarily the customer, I'm talking about your devs.
So when we do our estimates, we think about, how long will it take to get tickets ready? How long will it be in development? How long will it be in QA? And then pushing forward. So we make sure to think through all of that. And yes, there is a little bit of padding to make sure that it's not, okay, we know that this will take, it will absolutely take 12 hours. It's like we actually do kind of a confidence level and sort of figure it out from there. So. All right, one more question, yeah.
Going to the listening in groups, how do you handle when there's like a bit of a power play going on? So if you've got someone from the marketing department, someone from the IT department, and you don't want to be seen to be taking sides, and how do you handle that?
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good question. So the way that generally happens, first of all, it depends if you are internal or not. If that's happening with the client side and I'm on the outside, I'll actually say, you know what, this is a great conversation and I'm sure it pertains to what we're doing, but we do actually only have a set amount of time, so we really need to table this to make sure we get to everything else. So can you all go offline, schedule a time, make a decision and come back? Because at least that way you're not listening to somebody's internal stuff. If it is internal, honestly, sometimes you just use the same type of situation and the same response. But, it is, I feel like, good to repeat what each side is saying and then say, okay, what is the goal that we're trying to get at? If the goal, again, comes into what you're trying to do, then it's sort of figuring out how to, do we talk about this now? Do we set up another meeting? Do they do it? If it's not related to you. So I hate to say, I don't have an exact, I think it depends on the context, but, don't be afraid to tell people, table the conversation, and then come back, because you all have goals for the meeting. You can't meet for, 8 hours during the day. So yeah. All right. So if anybody has any other questions, feel free to come up or send me an email, send me something through Twitter, whatever works best for you. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.